SEP FanFic Readings presents Thanks to the Photographs by Unstable Hufflepuff. Chapter 18. Cheers, sincerely, hoping you are well. Love, Lavender. Hermione laid in bed, curled on her side and hidden beneath the duvet. The curtains were drawn shut, and she'd been there, awake, for so long, that truly she had no idea if it was morning or not. She'd gotten possibly an hour of sleep before waking amidst a horrible dream. Funny, she thought somewhat bitterly. That dream would have been welcome not so long ago. It had taken place in St. Mungo's, which was common for a number of her old nightmares. In fact, initially, she'd assumed that it was an old nightmare reappearing due to stress. The one where she hadn't been so lucky all of those years ago at Malfoy Manor. The one where she'd helped Alice Longbottom collect bubblegum wrappers for Neville when he came to visit. The one where she and Frank Longbottom sat and stared at a blank wall together for hours on end. But no, it was another nightmare entirely. She was laying in a hospital bed, a small infant with a tuft of red hair happily snoozing in her arms. The whole Weasley family was present. Molly was sitting bedside and knitting a blanket for the baby. Arthur had an old camera out and was taking photographs to remember the day by. Ron was laughing loudly with Harry, grinning wider than ever. George popped a bottle of champagne, and Fleur told him that wasn't allowed, but not before the sound startled the baby enough to wake it. It cried, and Hermione could not calm it. "Is this really what you wanted?" asking a drawling voice. She looked up, only to find the room had been emptied. In the doorway stood Draco. "Please, Draco, you have to help me," she cried, rocking the baby desperately. "I can't get it to stop." Draco spoke again as though he hadn't heard her. "What does it mean that I, someone who repeatedly told you how little you were worth, am here, and they are not?" That question haunted her even in consciousness. It was still swirling around in her head when he found her. Sometime after breakfast had been served in the great hall. He sat down on the edge of the mattress, and she poked her head out when she felt the bed dip. "I take it you've seen, then," he said. Hermione frowned, and he lifted up the morning's edition of the Daily Prophet. On the first page of the Society section, printed in big, bold letters, was the headline, "Ron Weasley and wife welcome baby girl." "Oh, I know," she mumbled. Then she turned onto her stomach to bury her face in her pillows, muffling her next words slightly. "Harry sent me an owl last night." Draco merely hummed in response. Then he waited, possibly for her to say more, but when she remained silent, he heaved a great sigh and dropped his hand to rest on her hip. "You hate him," he said. "I don't understand why this bothers you so much." "It's not about him." "Then what is it about? It's not healthy to just mope around in a bed like this, Granger. You normally don't let the news get to you this much. I mean, they hardly even mentioned you in this article. It was pretty much just an announcement." Hermione huffed and threw back the duvet, sitting up against the headboard. Draco looked at her, partly concerned, and perhaps also partly peeved, but she didn't know why. "It's just," she began, and cringed when her voice cracked. "That was supposed to be me," she finished helplessly. "But you didn't want this life," said Draco with a furrowed brow, gesturing to the paper in his grasp. "You would have been miserable in her position." I know," said Hermione, her eyes stinging a little. "But it's still... that was supposed to be me. That was supposed to be my family. And now it's not, and I haven't got any family left." She held her breath for a moment, biting down on her lip to keep it from wobbling, and tried to regain some sense of control. But at his next words, the tears she was fighting to hold back began to slip down her face. "What about your parents?" She shook her head, choking on a sob. "Granger. Hermione, what happened to your parents?" Draco tossed the prophet to the ground and twisted around to face her, taking her face into his hands and forcing her to look at him. "Hermione, what do you mean you haven't got any family left?" I just wanted them to be safe," she whispered. "They knew too much." She watched the blood slowly drain from his face and felt, not for the first time, a sharp pang of guilt. "Hermione, what did you do?" "I made them..." She let out a gasping sob. "I made them forget. They don't know who I am anymore. Draco, they don't even know they have a daughter." Draco took a moment, perhaps to let the full weight of her admission hit him, or perhaps to simply gather himself, before kicking off his shoes and slipping under the duvet with her. He pulled her into his arms and held her tightly as she cried into his chest, soaking the front of his button-up shirt. "The Weasleys. They were my only family Harry and I had, and now only George and Ginny will speak to me. I'm so lonely, Draco." He rubbed soothing circles on her back with one hand and buried the other in her curls, all the while telling her to take deep breaths. Eventually her breathing slowed to match the rise and fall of his chest, and she lay there, feeling almost numb as the rest of her tears fell. "You know, when my mother came to visit," he said heavily, "she told me if I kept heading down this path I'm on, I'd better be prepared to find a new family." He sighed deeply and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "If you're alone, then we'll be alone together." "You promise?" she asked, sniffling. "I promise. Believe me, Granger, I'm not going anywhere." She held him tighter than she should have. Hermione's mood improved as the week went on, though she developed a tendency to get distracted during classes. She tried to shove the thoughts of one family she could not have deep down into the recesses of her mind, but they managed to pop up again and again nonetheless. She reminded herself of Draco's promise, but that wasn't something she was too keen on holding on to. She didn't want to depend on him. She was supposed to be independent. But it was difficult when he was always there, teasing her until she relaxed enough to laugh with him, massaging her feet when collapsing on the sofa after a long day. She was glad that he never expected anything from her, especially because she didn't think she had anything left to give him. "We'll go to Theo and Pansy's tonight," Draco told her briskly on Friday morning, as they made their way down to the great hall from her living quarters. "You can get as drunk as you like, and I'll take care of you." "Oh, please," Hermione rolled her eyes, smiling fondly. "Don't pretend like you won't be in a similar state. Need I remind you of what happened last week?" "That's quite unnecessary," said Draco quickly. "I can recall it just as well on my own." "Are you sure? Because I seem to remember you passing out on the front steps." "Really no need to dwell on it. After screaming at Blaze that you needed to keep us all safe from Dementors, feel free to stop talking at any point." "Claiming a twig as your wand." "Granger, I beg you." "Because you said Harry had stolen the real one." "Children!" They entered the great hall, inside of which hundreds of students were taking their breakfast and muttering sleepy acknowledgments to each other, and Hermione promptly covered her mouth with her hand to stifle her laughter. Not one person batted an eye at seeing her and Draco approach together. It had become one of the many norms of life at Hogwarts, that were eventually accepted without question by those within the castle, but would be odd to anyone else. Sort of like the doors that pretended to be walls, and the terribly inconvenient vanishing steps. The only people that ever reacted were the members of the staff. Minerva eyed them with a slight smile on her face, which was fairly surprising. Both Madame Hooch and Madame Pomfrey were prone to fits of near-hysterical laughter when they spotted Hermione and Draco whispering, or their hands wandering more than they should, as though neither could quite get over the irony of the situation. Professor Vector raised his eyebrows at them a lot. Professor Sinestra had a tendency to shake her head in exasperation. Veronica frequently asked questions about their sex life that were so crude they often made Neville choke on whatever he was eating. Professor Slughorn, according to Minerva, would be joining them for their holiday staff party later that month. Hermione was secretly excited to see how he might react. He was probably embarrassed to have had her in the Slug Club after all she'd become, if she was being honest. During her third period class that day, one student, a Hufflepuff third year, asked Hermione if Professor Malfoy's eyes were as dreamy up close as they were from afar. There was a lot of giggling throughout the class after that, and Hermione huffed irritably and gave them another reminder that they weren't to speak unless their question pertained to the lesson. Hogwarts was Hermione's safe haven, the place in which she was free from the public eye. She liked that no one was judging them anymore, but the fact that her being with Draco had come to be expected made her feel claustrophobic. The feeling stuck with her for the rest of the day, no matter how many times she told herself that she'd be drunk and happy at Knott Manor in a matter of hours. She was in a foul mood when Draco arrived at her office at the end of the day, and he made it his mission to free her of it. "Oh, yes, Draco, right there," she said, gasping. She had one hand buried in his hair and the other flat against her desk to hold herself up. He was getting very good at this particular act. "You're doing so good, so good. I'm so close. Oh, suckety bleh!" Hermione came with a shriek just as the door had clicked open, and Draco immediately raised his head from its place between her thighs to stare behind her in horror. His lips and chin were wet with the evidence of what he'd been doing. Hermione hurriedly hopped off the desk, pulling up her knickers, and spun around to face the door while Draco continued to sit there gasping. She didn't know whether to be relieved or not. "Pardon the interruption, Hermione," Fleur said, biting her lip as though to hide her amusement. "We did not think you would be, shall we say, indisposed." That's all right," said Hermione breathlessly. She was very aware of the fact that her face was red, for more reasons than just embarrassment. "I thought the door was locked. Apparently not. You can turn around now, Bill." Bill cleared his throat uncomfortably before peering over his shoulder. Satisfied she was fully clothed, he turned back around, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Hello, Hermione. Malfoy." Hermione gave him a tight-lipped smile and barely audible greeting. When Draco said nothing, she glanced back at him, then hissed, "Draco, for fuck's sake, wipe your face!" Draco hastily wiped his mouth on the sleeve of his robes, then stood, an expression of cool indifference replacing the previous one of mortification. "Mr. and Mrs. Weasley," he said, inclining his head slightly towards Bill and Fleur. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" "We came to see Hermione. Do you mind if we have a moment of her time?" Before Hermione could answer, Draco asked coldly, "What reason do you have to speak to her now?" Fleur released a small sigh. "Because I did not understand why she did what she did until now, and I owe her an apology." Hermione's mouth fell open in shock. Draco, apparently satisfied, gave her hand a brief squeeze before swiftly leaving the room. Okay. Have a seat." She gestured to the 2 chairs opposite her desk, and Bill raised an eyebrow at her. "Are those safe to sit in?" he asked, instantly receiving a sharp look from his wife. "Sorry, that was a little uncalled for." "Don't worry about it," said Hermione awkwardly, tucking a few rogue curls behind her ears purely for something to do with her hands. She was still out of breath, and her hands had become terribly sweaty. Bill gave a great sniff and immediately grimaced. "Shit. Let me open a window real quick." Once they were settled and Hermione had cast a cleaning charm on her desk and sat down behind it, Fleur reached into her handbag and withdrew an envelope with Hermione's name on it. She slid it carefully towards her. "That is from Lavender." Hermione did not know what to say, and stared at the envelope for a moment, half expecting it to suddenly return red and reveal itself as a howler. "I have been with her all week, helping Poppy get settled," Fleur continued, her tone usually timid. "Lavender and I have not always seen eye to eye, but she spoke of you at length, and... She made a terrible sound and covered her cheeks with her hands. "I have been horrible to you, Hermione. To shame another woman for... Oh, what kind of woman would I be to have stooped so low?" Bill rubbed her back soothingly. "These Weasleys, they took me in. I was safe from the worst of the war because of them, and I just could not understand why you would not give Ron a second chance, after they had done the same for you. I thought that you should have at least let him explain. But you were just a girl, and your heart had been broken. I should not have been so cruel to you." Fleur paused, inhaling sharply and looking as if she were willing herself not to cry. "That letter, it will explain everything. Lavender asked me to bring it to you. She cannot leave Poppy at the moment. Well, I think she was a little nervous to see you. I hope you do not think so poorly of me now. I am so sorry, Hermione." Still Hermione said nothing. She merely stared at Fleur blankly, her mouth hanging open in shock. "Bill!" "Oh, yes, I'm sorry too, Hermione," said Bill hastily, shifting a little in his seat. "Please know that you will always be welcome at Shell Cottage from this day forward. Charlie passes on his apologies, then I will be speaking to Percy and Audrey when we see them on Sunday at the Burrow." Hermione blinked stupidly, seeming to understand that she wasn't going to say anything. Fleur stood. She gestured towards the unopened envelope on the desk. "Just read it, Hermione," she said, and Bill got to his feet, scratching the back of his head. "I hope after you will come visit us. Victoire has been asking after you. Teddy has been talking so much about you, and she is jealous that she has not seen you herself." Hermione nodded her head slowly, and then watched as they left the room, closing the door behind them and leaving her to transfer her stare to the envelope. She could not comprehend what had just happened. Over 2 years it had been since she'd heard word from any one of the Weasleys besides George and Ginny. Over 2 years, And here they were apologizing for jumping to conclusions. What the hell had Lavender said? And why now? When Draco returned to her office shortly after they left, inquiring as to what happened, Hermione could only shake her head in disbelief. By the time they had arrived at Manor, however, her bewilderment had turned into complete and utter outrage. Are you fucking kidding me? Over 2 years, Draco. And only now do I get to, oh, I'm so sorry, please don't think poorly of me, with no other explanation. I mean, what the fuck? Well, I suppose you could read the letter from Lavender, Hermione scoffed, pushing open the grand front doors and storming inside, her heels clicking loudly on the marble floor. Please. I bet you anything she'll play the victim. Pansy stood from the sofa to greet them as they entered the sitting room, a bright smile on her face and a pink, bubbly drink in her hand. Upon seeing Hermione's expression, she looked to Draco for explanation, her free hand curled into a fist and resting on her hip in a surprisingly threatening manner. It wasn't me, said Draco at once, holding his hands up. Hermione strode past him to steal Pansy's drink out of her hand. I didn't do anything wrong. You all right, Granger? Asked Theo warily, staring up at her from the sofa. You seem a little upset. A little? Said Blaise. Bill and Fleur Weasley came to see me this afternoon, said Hermione, after finishing Pansy's drink. Such a good friend Pansy was, she thought, forgetting her a new one straight away. To apologize. Apologize? Asked Pansy, raising an eyebrow. For what? For shaming me. Hermione practically growled and took a sip of her drink rather than continuing. I still think you should read the letter before coming to any conclusions, said Draco, taking a seat next to Blaise. You know what, Draco? You and your logic can just fuck right off. Should we be checking to see if she's polyjuiced? Blaise whispered to Draco with a snort. I do agree that it is a little suspicious that you're only hearing from them now, he told Hermione, as he strode over to the drink cart and fixed himself a drink. And you have every right to be furious with them. You're damn right I do. But you should still read the letter, he continued pointedly. A tumbler of fire whiskey in his hand, he dropped into the seat next to Blaise. It would be downright stupid to make a decision without first considering all the information available to you. You sound like such a Slytherin. Excuse you, snapped Pansy, waving an angry finger in Hermione's face. There shall be no trashing of Slytherin House under this roof. Hermione set her drink down purely so that she could cross her arms over her chest. She dropped onto the sofa and pouted at Draco. Don't pretend you don't think that way too, Granger, he said, exasperated. In fact, I believe your logic is the sole reason Potter and Weasley have lived this long. Theo hummed in agreement. It's just, I mean... Hermione let out a harsh breath, pressing her hands to her cheeks as though to contain her frustration. They treated me horribly, and now they, what, expect me to suddenly forgive them, for things to go back to the way they were. The room became silent. She glanced around to find that not one of them was looking at her, but instead pointedly staring at inanimate objects and slowly sipping their drinks. What? She asked warily. What is this? Theo sighed, meeting her gaze. You forgave us, didn't you? He said softly. Well, that's different. Is it? Well, yes, of course. Have they treated you any worse than Pansy has treated you? Than Draco has? They made you miserable for years. Draco hexed your teeth once. Pansy slipped information to Rita Skeeter that wound up on the front page news. You were painted a whore at 15. And what did we all do? We laughed at you. We spread rumors that might have made it worse. Draco watched his aunt torture you. If you hadn't been rescued, he likely would have stood there and watched you die. Or worse. Hermione felt cold suddenly, starting in her chest and then spreading, leaving goosebumps across her skin. Theo held her gaze, his face abnormally hard, and she found that she could not look away. How is what they've done any worse? He asked. If you were able to accept our apologies, what's stopping you from accepting theirs? She had not thought about it like that. If Fleur and Bill had apparently changed their minds about her, had come to plead for her forgiveness, just like Draco had back in September, why was she acting like this? Why had she just sat there stupidly not saying anything? And it hit her, like a punch to the gut, that it was because she had expected more from them. The hurt Draco and Pansy had caused her had been unsurprising. It didn't feel like a betrayal, and so it was easier to accept their forgiveness. The Weasleys, on the other hand, had been her family. She had loved them. She still did. Otherwise she would not miss them so much, right? Their treatment of her had broken something, whereas with Draco and Pansy, there hadn't been anything there to break. But perhaps she should at least listen, should hear what they had to say. She didn't have to forgive them, but it would be hypocritical of her, wouldn't it, to hear Draco out but not them? Hermione stood up unsteadily, wiping her suddenly sweaty palms on the skirt of her dress. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out, so she simply bowed her head and left the room. None of them came after her. She apparated the second she reached the front steps of Knot Manor, her body heavy with not dread, but something similar, and when she arrived back at the front gates of Hogwarts, it took all of her self-control to keep moving, to force herself up the snowy grounds and into the warmth of the castle. She dragged herself up to her office, ignoring anyone she happened to pass, scarcely noticing their presence at all. The letter from Lavender remained untouched on her desk, exactly where she had left it. She removed her coat slowly, draped it over her chair, and sat down. She stared at the envelope with her name on it for a long moment, and then, with a deep breath, she reached for it with trembling hands, and unsealed it to retrieve the letter. Dear Hermione, I was sorted into Gryffindor, the house of the brave, they say. I don't feel all that brave anymore. Sometimes I think I used up all my bravery. Parvati is constantly telling me how ridiculous that is, but I can't stop myself from believing it. You see, if I were braver, you would have received this letter a long time ago. If I were braver, maybe I wouldn't be where I am now at all. This is my attempt at an apology, in case that wasn't already clear. I hear the way that people talk about you these days, and it makes me sick. Worse is that I played a part in it, and even worse, because of my 2 daughters. I could not possibly regret that. If it weren't for me and my lack of bravery, they wouldn't be here. This apology already sounds dreadful. Let me try again to explain. You've seen the scars, I'm sure. The ones that Fenrir Greyback left. I'm lucky to be alive after what he did. The scars shouldn't mean anything to me, but they do. You'll think I'm vain, I know you always have, but a lot of my bravery came from how I looked. If I felt pretty, I could do anything. A little lipstick and a cute skirt, and I was unstoppable. It's hard to feel pretty now. When I bumped into Ron and the 3 broomsticks that night, he made me feel pretty. I was plenty jealous of you at the time, I won't lie. You came to Hogwarts with frizzy hair and ridiculously large teeth, no offense, and yet you wound up so beautiful. And I was damaged. A silly thing to be bitter about, but I'm trying to be honest here, so forgive me. It wasn't that I was still interested in Ron. I mean, please, I wasn't 16 anymore. But he made me feel good. And he told me you 2 had to split up, and I thought, wow, he'd rather be here with me than off with her. I cannot describe how much I miss the confidence that comes with a thought like that. He sent me an owl the next day, saying that he'd been mistaken, that the 2 of you were still together. I didn't respond. Truth be told, I was quite set on never speaking to either one of you ever again. I'm so sorry for that, Hermione. But when I realized I was pregnant, I knew I needed him there. I needed him to be involved, and for that I am not sorry. I never thought I'd have a proper family of my own, not after what Greyback did. I didn't think a man would ever find me pretty enough to marry, so I jumped at the opportunity when it presented itself, even if it made me a bad person. Besides, I was already ugly. Add being a single mother to that, and no one would ever want me. A baby out of wedlock. My mother lost her mind, let me tell you. Ron proposed shortly after you moved away. It was Molly's idea. He hadn't seemed to want it. The baby, yes. I'm sure you know how much being a father meant to him. But he didn't want me. I suppose I was just desperate enough to pretend. The wedding date was also Molly's idea. She said we had to be married soon, before I started showing. On that, she and my mother were in agreement. And I didn't know why the date she'd chosen was so familiar. Ron was drinking a lot back then. He wasn't even aware of when we'd be marrying until a week beforehand when he heard Jenny screaming at the mother about it. Everyone had already RSVP'd, so it was too late to reschedule. That's what Molly said anyway. This is totally embarrassing. But when I realized I was getting married on your birthday, I lost my lunch all over Harry. He didn't speak to me for 2 weeks, but I can't really blame him. It was so gross. Parvati wants me to apologize to you for her. She wrote a lot of articles that went out about you. She works at Witch Weekly now, did you know? She's really good. Her career is the most important thing to her, and she says that's why she kept writing about you. It was nothing personal. For the last 2.5 years, I've had the life I've always wanted. The husband, the child, the cozy family home. The life I'd given up on. I tried to be grateful, and I was, but it never felt real. Probably because it wasn't. I had a husband that only slept with me when he was drunk, that regularly called me by another's name, and a sister-in-law that accidentally stepped on my toes when she walked past. Ron's a good father to Rose. Ginny told me that was the name you'd picked out. I'm so sorry about that. When she was born, though, and Ron suggested it, I couldn't think of anything better. I suppose you did always have the best ideas. It often feels like I'm living someone else's life. Probably because I am. I guess that's karma, right? Ron and I don't belong together any more now than we did at 16. It's the life I'm in love with, not him. He feels the same. We've been discussing a divorce, but pretend you don't know that because we haven't told anyone yet. Well, I told Pravati, but that hardly counts. I know that if we were to split, Ron would still be there for Rose, and now Poppy too. The problem is, I doubt I'm going to get another shot at my dream of a perfect family, am I? No, I was lucky to get what I have now. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but I hope that you can understand why I did what I did in the past. I hope you don't hate me as much as I would if I were in your position. I also hope that what Rita Skeeter claimed in the Prophet was true, because yes, okay, he was a Death Eater, but also, damn, he's fit, Hermione. Fit as fuck. I'm sorry, this isn't my business. I shouldn't have written that. Oh, well, it's too late now. I hope the sex is good. Wow, sorry. I shouldn't have written that either. I'm ending this letter now. Sorry, again. Cheers. Sincerely. Hoping you are well. Love, Lavender.